Welcome back, everybody, to the Building Lifelong Athletes podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Rennicke. Thanks so much for stopping by. If you've never been here before, the goal of this podcast is to help keep you active and healthy for life through actionable, evidence-informed education. Today, we're doing another dive into literature, so let's get started. All right, so let's dive into the first article. It is titled Exploring the Longitudinal Association Between Stress and Unhealthy Eating Behaviors. And this is done in the Netherlands. And specifically here, we're looking at university students. And we know that university students, or at college, they experience a lot of stress due to new environments, right? New academic demands, social changes. They don't have their support system anymore. They have harder classes, lots of things going on, and that can be very stressful. And long-term stress can lead to negative coping mechanisms like unhealthy eating. Those are the things we're looking at here. And the purpose of the study, well, the purpose was to understand how prolonged stress influences unhealthy eating behaviors over a period of time. And they also wanted to look at factors like if physical activity, BMI, and loneliness played a role into monitoring these associations. And they're trying to figure out, there's kind of a gap in research on stress and eating behaviors in young adults. And so specifically, that's what they were looking at. From a background perspective, previous research, there are cross-sectional studies that have shown a link between stress and unhealthy eating, with individuals often consuming more high-fat and sugary foods under stress, right? That just seems to be our experience. Is like when you're feeling bad, you just want to grab something. That's terrible and eat it. That's just what it goes. The evidence, though, however, for a longitudinal link in terms of how stress over time affects the eating habits is less established, and we don't really know. And not all individuals react the same to stress, right? Some eat more, some eat less, some make no changes. So that's what we're looking for. And here specifically, they're looking at specific moderating factors, right? So physical activity. Can physical activity mitigate stress-related eating by enhancing physiologic satiety and emotional regulation? That's one question. The idea is that those people who had an elevated BMI that they had when you exercised, it helped better in terms of decreasing your amount of eating. That's what their idea is. And also BMI, individuals with a higher BMI are more prone to stress eating due to impaired inhibitory control. Those are what we're looking to, and it kind of leads to this vicious cycle. And they're also worried about, hey, does loneliness play impact on that as well? So previous data has also shown that social isolation can exacerbate stress and lead to unhealthy eating as a coping mechanisms. And 30 to 40% of college students complain of some sort of loneliness. So they're saying, hey, does loneliness, does BMI, does physical activity, do those things, which we've seen previously in data, can play a role with satiety and eating? Do those affect these college students as well? And moving on to their objective and hypotheses of the study, the primary objective was to examine if prolonged stress in university students is associated with increased unhealthy eating behaviors over time. And specifically, they looked in their specific hypotheses, stress at time 1 or T1. They thought it would be positively associated with unhealthy eating at time 2, which is later, about 6 months later. So they're saying, hey, stress here early, 6 months later will still affect you. And on top of that, for physical activity, they thought that physical activity will buffer the association between stress and unhealthy eating, meaning that if you exercise more, we are less likely to have poor eating habits in the future. And then on top of that, they also thought that the buffering effect of physical activity will be stronger for students with a higher BMI or with greater loneliness and seeing better outcomes, saying, hey, if you exercise, or that's going to help you if you have a higher BMI, or if you're more lonely, that's going to be there. And so we're kind of seeing, hey, how do these relationships all affect each other? That's what they're mainly looking at here. For the methods, this was a longitudinal survey study with 2 time points, like I mentioned, T1 and T2, about 6 months apart. And participants here, there were about a little over 1,300 university students from Radboud University. And demographics-wise, predominantly female, average about 22 years old. And the inclusion criteria ensured that participants were between 19 and 30. So that's the average, but overall skewed a little younger. And for measures, what they did is they gave a bunch of surveys, right? So they gave someone called the sweet and savory snack intake, which is an adaptation of a food frequency questionnaire. Kind of, if you have a higher score, indicates higher intake of sweet and savory snacks. We also measured uncontrolled eating using 3 items from the loss of control overeating scale. So once again, scale. And then stress, gave another survey, 10-item perceived stress scale, seeing what's going on. In physical activity, they measured that using the International Physical Activity Questionnaire, short form. Long story short, they did that for loneliness as well too. So they just gave a bunch of surveys, say, hey, what's going on? So they didn't measure anything necessarily. And they kind of ran a correlation analysis first. So what they see? Well, they found with stress and eating behavior, there was a significant correlation. Stress at time 1 was significantly correlated with uncontrolled eating at T2. So uncontrolled eating there. However, Stress was not correlated with sweet or savory intake at T1 or T2. So what they're saying is, hey, they found stress at the first time point to be associated with uncontrolled eating, but not necessarily with sweet or savory snack intake. So just something to mention there. And then physical activity wise, physical activity at the first time point was negatively associated with stress and uncontrolled eating at time 2, particularly in those with higher BMI. So what that means in English is the higher physical activity was linked to less stress. So that kind of makes sense that intuitively know that people who are exercising more tend to have less stress. However, we didn't find an association between physical activity and sweet or savory snack intake. So that's our association kind of analysis there. Now, moving on to the regression analysis, this kind of brings it in a little bit. The way I think about it is that we kind of have the correlation analysis and now we have the regression analysis. In short, correlation, the analysis they're looking at whether two variables are related, meaning, hey, is there some sort of signal to this noise? While the regression analysis determines if one variable can predict or explain changes in another. And the regression kind of can control for more factors is the way I think about making it a more detailed exam of the relationship between these different variables. And so we're looking at the same outcomes, just with now kind of a little tighter window. And for stress and uncontrolled eating, what they found was that the regression analysis did show that higher stress at T1 was linked to greater uncontrolled eating at T2, just like we saw previously. They found no association again with snack intake. So stress at the first time point was not linked to changes with sweet or savory snack intake at T2. And then physical activity wise, there was no significant moderation of physical activity. So physical activity did not buffer the relationship between stress and unhealthy eating behaviors and suggests that physical activity may not actually universally protect against stress-induced eating. So really the big findings that they found was that yes, they did show that you had issues with uncontrolled eating. It didn't lead to an increased snack necessarily, and physical activity didn't really buffer it. And then there's an interaction analysis as well. And what this interaction analysis does, it helps researchers examine how multiple variables work together to influence some sort of outcome rather than looking at just two factors in isolation. And so there's kind of this two-way interaction, right? So a significant interaction between physical activity and BMI was found for uncontrolled eating, meaning that physical activity reduced uncontrolled eating only in those with a higher BMI, indicating this kind of this subgroup specific benefit, meaning, hey, the people who were in this group who had a higher BMI, who exercised, that seemed to be helpful with reducing uncontrolled eating. And that's really all they saw. And then there's a three-way interaction as well, where they found no significant three-way interactions between physical activity, BMI, loneliness at all. And so physical activity did not appear to mitigate stress-related eating differently based on loneliness. So it was really only BMI in those who had an elevated BMI. And so from a discussion, key findings perspective, stress and uncontrolled eating, stress was associated with a greater likelihood of uncontrolled eating, but not with an increased intake of snacks. So you might be like, well, what does that mean? That's what they found. It's kind of interesting that maybe uncontrolled eating doesn't necessarily mean you're snacking more, just eating more of the things that you're eating. That's kind of what we're thinking. And in terms of physical activity did not buffer the effects of stress on snack intake or uncontrolled eating in the general population. However, individuals with a higher BMI did benefit from increased physical activity in terms of reduced uncontrolled eating. So the implications of this is that stress may specifically affect the ability to control eating rather than the frequency of unhealthy snack consumption, meaning you're not eating more snacks, just like when you're eating more. And so also, we need to consider that tailored interventions that consider BMI may be effective in managing stress-related eating, as we saw that kind of BMI does have a relationship with that. And what are the limitations in future research? Well, limitations, smaller sample size, very specific, skewed mostly female, also self-reported measures, right? So lots of bias in reporting eating habits, physical activity, and stress levels. I think that's it. Measurement of snack was only registered for number of days, not total snacks. And so you're saying, okay, maybe if one day you had a really good day, but then the other day you ate like 1,000 bags of chips. Well, that could skew the numbers. So they could just be housing snacks, but the same number of days, so it looks no different. So, normally I snack on these days, but then if it's this day you're eating way more, that wouldn't account for it in these surveys. And then for baseline data, there was no baseline measure of uncontrolled eating, limiting kind of conclusions on what we see. And overall, as I mentioned, this is from a Dutch university, so a pretty homogeneous sample of these students, limits the generalizability to other populations. And hopefully in the future, we can have more diverse populations to look at the implications of stress and eating, all that stuff. And that's kind of the thing. So, but in summary, from a conclusion standpoint, the study demonstrates that prolonged stress in university students is associated with increased uncontrolled eating behaviors, but not with general snack intake. And physical activity, while it did moderate stress-related snack intake, it was associated with reduced uncontrolled eating only in those with a higher BMI. And so the implications really is that for interventions-wise, we should think about, what are the characteristics that we can look for, right? So maybe patients with higher BMI to effectively target stress-related eating issues. That's something we can think about. And at the end of the day, I think this is just a cool example. We know that when you're stressed, you tend to eat, right? And most people think it's chips and pizzas and whatever, and it might be, and who knows, that's just standard, everyone's diet these days. But this article showed specifically that when we're under stress, it may increase the amount of food you're eating, not necessarily the snacking that you're doing. Not perfect, but I think it was a cool study to look at and just kind of understand that, hey, when we're stressed, sometimes out of our control, even subconsciously, it affects our dietary habits. And that's really like the big takeaway from this is that, hey, when you're stressed, things can happen. It's just harder to stay on tracks, right? If you're stressed out, you just want to relax, lay down, go sit on the couch, eat some food. I get that. And so that's just one point to look at, that even subconsciously we might be looking at and eating more than we were thinking about. So that's something we want to consider. And that's why I thought this article is interesting. Now we're going to move on to our next article, which is looking at protein timing and muscle gain. So let's dive in. The title of this article is Timing Matters: The Effects of Protein Intake Timing on Resistance Training Outcomes. The main author here is Lack et al., and this was published in 2024 in Frontiers of Nutrition. And so let's dive in here. So introduction-wise, resistance training combined with sufficient protein intake is essential for growing muscles, for hypertrophy, and for also strength. But there's also lots of training variables like volume, intensity, and frequency to optimize muscle growth. However, there's different protein intake variables as well, meaning the total daily protein intake, protein distribution throughout the day, the timing relative to exercise, all these things that people pontificate about all the time on the internet. But however, the current consensus is that anything up to about 1.6 grams per kilogram per day has effects, and anything above that doesn't really lead to better gains in hypertrophy or strength. Specifically hypertrophy we're looking at here, but about 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. That's what you'll see everyone online talking about. We got to get that. That doesn't necessarily show you have to get there. They're saying when you get to above that, it doesn't necessarily have better improvements. And so you can actually have less than that and still make gains. That's kind of the nuance there, but that's what we're looking at here. And the study here, we've had previous studies that have provided mixed results regarding the optimal timing of protein intake for hypertrophy. Existing meta-analyses showed inconsistent findings due to lack of controls or different methodologies. And what they do is they'd give one group protein, but didn't give the same amount to anyone else or any protein at all to the control group. So it was kind of difficult. So the whole goal of this study was to compare the effects of immediate versus delayed, meaning right after exercise or 3 hours before or after exercise. So their immediate versus delayed protein intake on body composition and performance in resistance trained males. So moving to the methods, the participants here, we had 40 resistance trained males. So they've on average been exercising for a while. They're used to this. They're about 24 plus or minus 4 years. They train 3 or more times per week for a year. So they've been lifting for a while here. They can't use steroids or any other supplements, no medical issues, and they have consistent sleep. And their protein intake currently is less than 2 grams per kilogram per day. And in the final sample, we were supposed to have 40, we got 31. That's what happens because we had a couple of dropouts. And this was a randomized controlled trial. So this is kind of our gold standard here. The participants were divided into 2 groups. One was the immediate protein intake group. So pre and post exercise, they pretty much had protein right before and right after exercise. And then we had the delayed protein intake group, which took protein 3 hours before and after exercise. And from a protein supplementation, the participants consumed about 2 grams per kilogram per day, with 50 grams as whey protein concentrate during their training days. And we've had a bunch of things measured on them, right? Body composition, they're looking at skeletal mass, fat mass, and BMI. They looked at performance metrics like strength, specifically 1 rep max, endurance, vertical jump height, and Australian pull-ups were essentially inverted rows. When I saw Australian pull-ups, I was like, what are those? They're inverted rows. They looked at biochemical markers as well, looking at liver function, things like AST, ALT, GGT, which we've talked about before, kidney markers, creatinine, urea, and lipid profile, HDL, LDL, cholesterol. So they looked at a bunch of different things. Specifically, how did they randomize? So they used something called a block randomization approach. And that was to ensure that we had a balanced distribution. A matched pair design was implemented based on baseline skeletal muscle mass. So what they kind of did is they kind of matched people. So you had a baseline skeletal mass. We want you to be compared to this other person who's kind of similar. So they really kind of went far into this thing. It wasn't just like this group, that group. They kind of got granular with it as well, which is kind of cool. And from a training program perspective, I also thought this was really cool. They did a non-linear periodization model. And they had about 4 or 5 resistance training sessions per week, depending on their history and whatnot. So the 4-day protocol had an upper and lower body focus. This was given to people who generally did before the study less than 20 sets per week. And then they had a 5-day protocol, which added an additional upper body training day for participants with higher training volume. So if they had greater than 20 sets per week, they were at their baseline. I think this is really cool. The program design was subject specific, and that's awesome. We need more of this. A generic program that's given to someone maybe way too much or too little for someone. And this kind of gives the opportunity to get the best shot at getting results, because that's really what we want, right? And in this program, we did about 8 to 15 reps with a RIR, so reps in reserve of 1 to 2 for each set. So they're definitely working hard there, right? At the end of each set, you're getting 1 or 2, meaning you have only 1 or 2 reps left in the tank. That's working pretty hard. And it was supervised by a certified strength and conditioning specialist to make sure that everything was going on there. And then the protein supplement protocol, participants consumed whey protein concentrate. They gave 25 grams pre and 25 grams post. And the timing of it was the big factor we're looking at, right? So non-training days though, so that was on training days, non-training days, protein intake derived from dietary sources with guidance from a dietitian. And they tried to eat about 4 to 7 times per day with 20 to 40 grams of protein per meal to optimize muscle protein synthesis. So a pretty well thought out study. I think it's pretty cool looking through it, trying to compare people. And overall it's really, really cool. So at the end of the day, body composition wise, what did they do for that? They took measurements of the body composition pre and post. They used bioelectrical impedance. They used a specific, machine there to look at skeletal muscle mass, fat-free mass, and BMI. And overall, this is one of those things where bioelectrical impedance is where you use electricity to kind of run through and estimate what's going on. And they step on this machine, and you have to be, hydrated, fasted overnight, all that stuff, avoiding caffeine, alcohol, all that stuff. And overall, bioelectrical impedance is relatively high reliability, but it's not quite the gold standard like a DEXA is. But at the end of the day, this is what they use, so it's what we got. From a strength and performance assessment, the maximal strength, they did a 1 rep max test for leg press and chest press following just kind of general NSCA, so National Strength and Conditioning Association guidelines. Participants underwent familiarization with the testing protocol, so they made sure they're feeling good about the leg press and chest press, and then they did it. And then they also did a muscular endurance test, which conducted using the leg press and chest press machine at about 75% of what their 1 rep max was to assess their endurance capacity. They kind of did as many as they possibly could. And then they did maximum reps until technical failure. And then they also tested a couple other things like vertical jump height, and then the Australian pull-ups is what we mentioned. For blood tests, they also did a bunch of different things. As I mentioned before, taken pre and post intervention after fasting, markers are analyzed, and we mentioned the ones we got before. So moving on to the results here. Results, the 31 participants completed the 8-week intervention. The baseline characteristics were comparable between groups with no significant differences. From a body composition changes for skeletal muscle mass, it increased significantly in both groups in both the immediate and delayed protein intake. For fat mass and BMI, there were no significant changes observed. Biochemical markers, urea levels increased significantly in both groups because increased protein metabolism. So urea is a classic thing you'll see on labs for people with a lot of protein. Urea numbers will be up. They observed no significant changes though in the markers. From a muscular performance perspective, strength gains, there were significant improvements in leg press and chest press in both groups. And endurance performance, there were significant increases in Australian pull-ups while other metrics remained stable. Next, let's talk about training volume. So both groups showed similar training volume throughout the intervention with no significant time or group interactions. From a protein intake and dietary assessment compliance, the protein intake increased significantly in both groups, reaching that targeted 2 grams per kilogram per day. Carbohydrate and fat, they were maintained within acceptable micronutrient ranges. They said, hey, keep your macros relatively good. There's kind of a range of what you could get for your carbs and fat, and they kept it there. And it was monitored throughout the whole study with a dietitian and food tracking apps as well. And the key findings here, there was no significant difference between immediate and delayed protein intake. And the main conclusion here is that total daily protein intake is the most critical factor for muscle growth, regardless of intake timing. And the implications for this is that this kind of supports that the idea that the quote unquote anabolic window is broader than we previously thought, right? Lasting several hours. So you don't need to slam down a protein shake immediately. And it seems like training adherence and consistency of protein intake and your physical fitness and lifting, those things were key drivers of muscle hypertrophy and performance. So sticking to a program, getting enough protein in general, that's the biggest thing. And I think this is cool because, a lot of times people think of, you see people drinking the protein shakes while they're working out or right after you have to have it. And that's not wrong. You can definitely do that, but it just goes to show here you can be more flexible in that. You have a bigger window of the anabolic window, so you don't have to run home and slam a protein shake necessarily right away. There were some limitations. Obviously, this is only an 8-week study, may not capture long-term differences. They did use bioelectrical impedance, like I mentioned before, instead of DEXA, so we could have maybe some slight body composition change that we couldn't quite pick up, but the fact that we used the same thing for both makes me feel better about that. There was some variability between participants. There's differences maybe in their training history, fitness level, and genetics could all affect things as well. And kind of going into conclusions though is High protein diets significantly enhance muscle performance and skeletal muscle mass in resistance trained males, irrespective of timing. And the big takeaway from here is focus on achieving sufficient daily protein intake rather than stressing over precise timing. And how does this change anything for me? Well, like this is already on my radar. That's what I've been seeing in the literature. And so nothing really groundbreaking. However, it's just another piece of evidence that hyper-optimization isn't necessary. Get enough protein and you'll be good enough. By far and away, the most important point is to intake enough protein throughout the day. That's the biggest thing. And train hard, right? That's the biggest thing. These people train hard. It was RIR 1 to 2, meaning 1 or 2 reps in reserve. They're going hard in their sets. This isn't just, hey, doing a couple there. If you want to have these gains, then you have to push it. And that's really what the big thing is. And it's really not that hard. That's the biggest thing. That's why I really like this study. And I'm glad that my biases are being confirmed once again. I know it's bad, but obviously I'll change my mind if things come up. But really, like hyper-optimization of everything is just really not that important. Unless you're like an elite athlete. If you're an elite athlete where every single thing matters and that can be your edge and that can get you $1 million contract, I get that. Then, hey, we got to nerd out. But here it's like, hey, I want to get stronger and I want to get bigger. Okay, what does it say? Work hard, lift heavy things, get enough protein throughout your day. Like that's really what it comes down to. It's that simple. Worrying about perfect this and perfect diet and perfect supplement this and there, like that's not necessary. I think the data keeps continuing to show that just be consistent in your training and consistent with what you eat and you should be good. And going forward, I'd love to see more of this just to kind of corroborate it or maybe, call it into question. I'm not sure. I'd love to see though the impact of protein timing in different populations, whether that's older adults or untrained individuals. And then it'd be cool if we did this study with index. I think it could be helpful. But overall, I thought this was a really cool study. Once again, I would like to reiterate, and I wanted this to portray to people listening that, hey, focus on the big things, right? I talk about big rocks all the time. Big rocks are nutrition and resistance training when it comes to hypertrophy and strength. Do the big things. Don't worry about the small things and you'll be good. For our next article, we're going to talk about trust. So trust of the public of nutritional information. So let's dive in. So this topic that we're going to talk about, the title is called Brief Overview of the Survey Conducted by the International Food Information Council. So this is kind of a outline. It's not necessarily a formal research study, but this is what they found. This IFIC, this International Food Information Council, did this survey, and this is what we're discussing. It explores the trust in food and nutrition science among U.S. adults. And this survey aimed to understand the public's attitude towards the science of food and nutrition, recognizing the importance of trust in shaping adherence to dietary policies. So that's what we're looking at here. And so let's dive into the survey methodology. This was a survey done in July 2024 with about 1,000 U.S. adults age 18 or older. And the results were weighted to make sure it represented the U.S. accurately. And they did find with their stats, they were within their confidence intervals, and there's a good representation of the United States. But that's the methodology. Only 1,000 people, but still be kind of cool. Here's kind of some key findings. The key findings about trust in food nutrition is that 38% of Americans report strong trust. So that's either between 8 and 10 on a 0 to 10 scale in food, nutrition, and diet science. So 38% of people have strong trust. 21% are ambivalent and 12% express distrust. And 53% of those who with lower trust say that they'd be more willing to change their diets if they had more confidence in nutrition science. And quite honestly, I have no clue what to make of that. So pretty much half the people who don't have any trust in science would pretty much do nothing ever. Even if the science got better, they wouldn't change their diet. So that's kind of interesting to me. People who had no trust, half of those people said, yeah, like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Like nothing you can do is going to get me changed. And that's America. That is like literally America in a nutshell. It's just like, you can do whatever you want, but I'm not going to believe it. And so that's fantastic. And that's very not helpful, but fortunately that's still a smaller percentage of people. And these are the people we call in the pre-contemplation stage of change, right? Behavior change, there's different stages, and pre-contemplation means like, hey, I'm not ready to change yet. And that's okay. Sometimes it takes multiple passes to get there, but that's where we're at. And next, let's talk about who Americans trust for food information. And the most trusted sources of food information are food and nutrition scientists, so 55% of people say that, followed by medical doctors and nurses, 51%, and then registered dietitians, 41%. And honestly, this surprised me, mainly because people think doctors are good advice for nutrition. That's to me, and I'm a physician, right? So that's me. We as physicians get literally like 6 lectures on nutrition, and it's all like biochemistry. Like, hey, how do you process this? Like what, in the urea cycle, like all these like biochemical mechanisms, that's like nutrition. That's what we get. Is literally, it was like probably maybe a week on that is where we were. And we don't get anything on behavior change or counseling on diet. Everything I know is because I've spent countless hours being a nerd and learning on my own. So like your run-of-the-mill doctor, and once again, I'm not saying like, oh, look, it's me, I am that. I'm just saying this is like a nerdy hobby of mine and I've gone down the rabbit hole. But if you don't do that, then it's going to be tough. Like everything I know is because it's just been something I've learned on my own, outside on my own time. And so if your standard doctor here is not going to do that, and I'm not saying that they're wrong, right? I'm not saying nutrition advice, this shouldn't be our field necessarily. I think we have a really unique impact as primary care physicians to be be able to counsel people and say, hey, this is what we should consider, this is what we look for. So I want that because I want that as part of my practice and be able to counsel on that. But it's not necessarily everybody's bread and butter or thing they want to do. So just understanding that your mileage may vary drastically between physicians. On top of that, people mentioned that about 29% of people trusted their family and friends. That was a big thing. So family and friends, 29%. They trust them more than government agencies and media outlets like television and news and newspapers. And so people trust family and friends more. And 66% of Americans would trust food advice if it came from a registered dietitian. That's cool. But then, and then on top of that, 64% said they would trust it if it cites scientific evidence. And then 59% would trust it if it were easy to follow. And then 26% of people say that they'd be more likely to trust information if it shocks or scares them, or if it's shared widely on social media. So we'll just step back there. A couple of different things is that 66% of people said they trust it if it comes from a dietitian, 64 if they had scientific evidence, 59 would trust it if it were easy to follow, but then 26% say they're more likely to trust information if it shocks or scares them, or it's on social media. I honestly think that's so like understated, like completely understated. It just shows that people place the most trust in individuals they know or professionals rather than government or media sources. So people very, very important. And then the whole shocking on social media thing, that honestly, that was shocking to me that it was that low. Social media is nothing but just scare tactics, right? I should title this something. You're going to die if you do this. And then people click on it, right? And I get it. You have to get the click so people see, they can't see your information, you get the click, but trying to scare people seems to work. And that's, even a quarter of people are, when they're scared, they seem to improve there. So their knowledge in terms of the things they would trust. And so I thought that was terrifying and scary, but overall that was still a minority, which is good. And then dietary recommendations. Overall, the public perception of these changing dietary recommendations is not great. About 79% of Americans believe that food recommendations are always changing, leading to feelings of confusion, frustration, doubt, and distress. And I get why people think like this, but I don't think it's really true. And hear me out. I know sometimes things will shift. It's first of all, they're talking about people think that overall big governing bodies and huge body research like that has been changing all the time. That's not what's happening. What they're hearing is multiple things on social media. Hearing this person talk about keto, this person talk about carnivore, this person talk about vegan, this person talk about intermittent fasting, whatever. Like they hear all these different things by the media and by random people. And by that they're conflating, saying, hey, the recommendations are changing. Recommendations have not changed that much. They've shifted for sure. Obviously, we know the food plate back in the day to my plate, but that's a slow and gradual change here in America. I think what people are talking about is just hearing the conflicting information back and forth. Overall, the general things that people have recommended for a long, long time have not changed. Yeah, we've changed a little bit on the idea of cholesterol intake or fat intake, maybe specifically not demonizing all fats, but really at the end of the day, like we didn't go from, hey, like fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes to just something drastically different. That's not the case. So that's not really changing, but the perception is, and perception's reality, right? If people think that it's moving all the time, that's what we have to think about. However, though, on a positive note, 35% of respondents feel curious and 14% feel inspired by these changes, meaning, hey, even from all this stuff, people can feel inspired. And the constantly shifting landscape of dietary advice does create an emotional burden for many, making clear and consistent guidance from professionals even more crucial. And then moving on to then trust for people. I thought this was super interesting. Trust in university-based science and scientists is the highest with about 49%. Net trust score compared to about 38% for scientists from the food industry and 25% from government. And so government scientists have the least amount of trust from people, which is interesting. And mixed teams of scientists in academia, industry, and government have a trust of about 39%. And overall, this indicates that the public values the perceived independence and credibility of academic institutions over other sectors, right? I think that kind of makes sense, right? If you are not funded by someone, you have less bias to there. And I do want to step back though. Just because someone receives funding from something does not inherently make their data to be biased. That's not the case, right? You're getting funded. That's the key. And I understand that, and you're publishing it. So I understand why people think that, but it's not necessarily that everybody who's had a study funded by something is doing something bad. Just kind of step back. But the public is generally that they trust academic scientists the most. And so what are the implications, right? Long-term health implications for professionals. And overall, as a health professionals, like we do play a pivotal role in communicating clear evidence-based nutrition advice to the public. That's important. And the public is more likely to trust advice that is simple and easy to follow and backed by scientific evidence. So shock-based or sensationalist advice is less trusted, although there's still a population that is, but it does indicate that we have measured, reliable communication, and we have to continue to collaborate with nutrition scientists and registered dietitians to make sure we're, presenting a consistent, unified message. For me, as I said before, my dietary approach is flexible, meaning, hey, whatever works for you is going to be where we're going with. And it's not just like what you think, right? Hey, like I think this is fine. Like, no, we look at your markers, right? We look at your body composition, we look at your lipids, your blood pressure, your everything. We look at everything and build this picture. And if it's not going in the direction we want, then that diet's probably not for you. We can alternate and move there. But I think there's just so many examples and data showing that you can do many, many things, that there's not necessarily one correct way. And then moving on here to public engagement with food and nutritional information. I thought it was kind of interesting that 52% of Americans are involved in private social media groups focused on food and nutrition with varying levels of activity. And 39% of respondents who notice social media headlines about food and nutrition search for more information about that online. So, 52% of people are just in dedicated groups. And then of those people, only 39% dig deeper. And so what that's telling me is people see headlines and the minority of them go and research further, right? They just say, hey, like I see this headline, it must be true. And the digital space is growing, right? And shaping public food knowledge, and highlights the importance of, once again, credible science-based information being available online. But the really big take home that I get from this is that people are seeing headlines, not doing any additional deep dive. And we hear that all the time. Like, hey, I saw this study. Like, did you see the study, or did you see a headline of the study or someone on social media? And a lot of times even the headlines people produce are more clickbaity than the actual research. I'm not blasting the research at all, but yeah, people aren't reading things or going deep at all. And so conclusion wise, at the end of the day, trust in food and nutrition science is really important for improving dietary behaviors and public health outcomes. And we're trying to, combat misinformation the best we can by providing consistent, clear, evidence-backed education. And, really when we step back as professionals, we can try to be clear in our communication. That's my biggest thing. And I think that I've learned from this and take away from me is, hey, how can I be clear in what I believe? And to be clear here, I'll just say, to be clear, I don't think there's one perfect diet. I think there's lots of similar characteristics. It's going to be a minimally processed diet, eating predominantly whole foods, and that keeps you in a caloric balance. That's like really, if I had to explain my nutritional dogma, that's like what it is. It's like, that's the big overarching goal, is to keep you in a caloric balance, and you eat unprocessed foods that are just food. That's the big thing there. And there's multiple ways to do it and going from there. But that's my takeaway. And so that's hopefully my clear advice to people. But overall, nutrition science, it makes sense that we're all over the place because nobody trusts anybody. They don't trust media. They don't know who to believe. They believe their friends. There's a whole lot going on there. But I thought it was an interesting topic, at least, to talk about. And that's going to conclude our podcast today. Thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, it'd mean the world to me if you gave us a 5-star review on your podcast player of choice, or if you share this with someone. I think sharing with someone is the greatest compliment you can give me, and we'd really appreciate that. But we're done for today. Now get off your phone, get outside, and we'll see you next time.